We are very happy to bring to you tonight the lecture as part of our New York Public Library Fellowship. For the New York Public Library Fellowship, we deeply value our collaboration with the New York Public Library and particularly with the Tarot Judaica division. We are very grateful to the Knapp Family Foundation for their crucial support of the pilot program that brought scholars to the Fordham-NYPL Fellowship for a full year, and we owe thanks to the Pickett Family Foundation and our dedicated advisory council for their steadfast support of this fellowship program over the years. So, thank you. Now it's my distinct pleasure to introduce to you tonight's speaker, Dr. Sierka. Dr. Sierka earned her PhD at the University of Munich with a doctoral dissertation focusing on the adaptation of divine chariot, merkavah, imagery from medieval Ashkenazi esoteric sources in Lurianic Kabbalah. She has held several prestigious positions, including being a Golda Meir Postdoctoral Fellow and a Minerva Fellow in the Department of Jewish Thought at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, a Harry Starr Fellow in Judaica at the Center for Jewish Studies at Harvard, and a Koret Fellow at Tel Aviv University. Her articles have appeared in leading journals, including Kabbalah, Journal for the Study of Jewish Mystical Texts, the Journal of Religion, and Harvard Theological. Dr. Sierka's research explores shifts in esoteric and kabbalistic doctrines, their philosophical inspirations, and their connections detectable in other domains of knowledge, such as medicine and astronomy, as well as in folk culture. We are thrilled to have her tonight with us as part of the Fordham-NYPL Research Fellowship, and she will be talking to us about the tangibility of the secret, a mystical view of the senses. Please join me in welcoming.
Working hopefully. Thank you very much for this wonderful introduction. It is very beautiful even for me. It's my great pleasure. Also taking part of the community at the New York Public Library. I am truly grateful to both co-directors of the Center for Jewish Studies at Fordham, Professors Teta and Professor Emmanuel, as well as I am fully grateful to the Tarot division in the New York Public Library for the great support of my stay here in New York. And I am truly thankful also for your coming, because it was just quite intense period in Jewish calendar, especially due to the coming Passover. I would like to wish you happy Seder, Chag Kasher V'Sameach, if you would like to celebrate Passover, because I am taking into account that not all the participants will necessarily celebrate this beautiful festival, but for all your coming festivals, my best greetings and best wishes. Today I would like to offer a kind of less typical lecture. I am calling it less typical because it is a kind of séance, as I would call it in French. I will not touch you physically, but I hope to touch you on the intellectual level, or on the level of thought of the mystical secret. And from the very beginning of this lecture, because I thought that the great idea would be to offer something much more multisensory than a typical lecture, I wish to invite you to pick just one apple for every single participant. One apple, a physical object. It will be our leitmotif for the entire lecture. And I wish to begin also with one short remark, which is very important for every one of us and for your expectation concerning this lecture, and especially for your expectation regarding any kind of historical lecture you most likely would like to receive. It will be neither kind of historical typology of Jewish mysticism, of any kind, historical description of Jewish mysticism and its evolvement from ancient till the modern period. It will be also not focused on one specific Kabbalist, which is the typical way how to give a lecture. Moreover, I would like to invite you to explore sensory, or rather meta-sensory experience within Kabbalistic texts. And therefore, to not offer you just a kind of general introduction into Kabbalistic sensorium, I wish to focus on one sense, namely sense of touch. However, before we will begin, it is very important to us to know how to approach Kabbalistic texts themselves, as their texture is slightly different from many typical ritualistic texts. Therefore, I will invite you to gaze at the very beginning at one very particular piece of art. If you will be shocked, maybe I'm sorry for a kind of erotical image. However, please look at this art form, having in mind what Maurice Merleau-Ponty said, that every historical object is a fetish. Therefore, in my personal opinion, gaze invites us to experience a kind of intimacy which is often leading from the sense of vision to sense of touch. And to be clear, I do not mean here any kind of gaze of a clinical pathologist or any kind of gaze which is only related to the general description of an object, but it is a kind of touching gaze. When a hidden desire can allow for a certain kind of transition from touch, from seeing to touch. So to have the embodied experience, to have an experience of being in body and feel or sense as body, to touch and being touched, because we are able to experience touch both actively and passively, as it is a part of greater phenomenology of perception, and it is also a part of our perceptual field. And here is a start point for my lecture. For the deluxe edition of the exhibition catalogue, Le Surréalisme en 1947, Marcel Deschamps cooperated with an Italian-born surrealist, Enrico Donati. They both met in New York in 1942. In order to better emulate the skin structure of a white female breast, they ordered from a Brooklyn company, it is quite interesting, a sufficient amount, namely 1999, of foam rubber breasts, which they later colored with the pinkish ink. However, they colored all these breasts with their fingers. The purple colored protruding breast protruding from the perforated velvet piece of cloth created by the artist evokes a peephole brassiere or an underbreast corset, luring the spectator's desire. The play continues when we are able to read the label, which was written also in the typical French Didon script, typical from all descriptions in the museums of that period. Prière de toucher, please touch. It is a kind of reversal of typical administrative directive used, for instance, in the museums. Prière de ne pas toucher. Please do not touch. Therefore, it is a subversive kind of encouragement to indulge in palpable pleasures. The memory mania and the synesthetic experience surfaced previously in Duchamp's word game called Litanie des Sons, which he published in 1922 under his name, one of many of his aliases, but it is drag persona invented by Duchamp himself, Rose Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv means in French, Eros is life. Here we are able to recognize another play, namely play pertaining to the same register of sacrum as the prière, prior to touch, revolving around the French homophones saint, saints, saint, rest, and singular verbal form of sentir, to sense. I will read you the French variant of it. Please look up the translation. Litanie des sons. Je crois qu'ils sont des bouts de son. Tais-toi, tu sens des bouts de son? Pourquoi sont-ils des bouts de son? Je veux sentir des bouts de son. End of quotation. Signhood, olfaction, touch, vision, prayer, and eroticism converge in a synesthetic encounter. Synesthesia is a composition of Greek preposition syn, meaning jointly at the same time, all together, alike, and the Greek noun aesthesis, signifying sense perception or sensation. Therefore, the simplest definition of synesthesia is a condition of joint sensory perception or even an anomalous blending of sensory perceptions produced by different senses. It means that often one sensory perception, for instance, hearing, has been translated into another sensory perception, into another sensory modality, which is, for instance, sense of touch, sense of smell, etc. It happens when, for instance, an uttered prayer or a poem is experienced in terms of smell. Spoken words take a visual shape, images illicit become quasi-palpable. One, especially a scholar of religion, can ask to which extent synesthesia differs from sensory hallucinations. Synesthesia and hallucination diverge on one point. The first, namely synesthesia, is triggered by a stimulus in one perceptual modality, like vision, hearing, etc., while the latter, hallucination, occurs without such external trigger, or it is only artificially induced by implementation of different entheogens or hallucinogens. However, synesthesia is also seen, especially in the modern research, as a form of neurodiversity, and in some of its cases, they are truly veridical perceptions. In contrast, hallucinations usually induced by entheogens, as I already mentioned, or drugs, in absence of any outside stimulus. Similarly, dreams. They occur in the condition of being asleep. Therefore, any external trigger cannot work actively, cannot be actively in play over this time. By touching on synesthesia, I am preparing you for confronting kabbalistic texts. Moreover, I wish to ruminate on the kindred nature of Duchamp's synesthetic experience with that of the mystics. Namely, it is well known that Duchamp himself was very interested in reading alchemical and hermetic literature, as well as his patron, American patron, Walter Conrad Arensberg was fascinated for occultism and cryptography, and this fascination was, of course, shared by the show. Giving the emphasis on the letter symbolism and enrichment of these many letter permutations in the show work with erotic imagery, certain analogies between the aforementioned traditions, especially Hermetic or alchemic, and kabbalistic lore are discernible. Addressing the sense of touch as the most erotically potent component within the esoteric and kabbalistic sensorium, it is incumbent upon me to introduce another very important concept, namely the concept of sensory imagination. What does sensory imagination mean, and what distinguishes imagining with the senses from both perception and conception? With this question in mind, we will approach the first quotation on our handout, the first text which I am offering in the translation into English, namely our part of Abraham Abulafia's work, or Hasechel. And we will look closer at Abulafia's pondering on comprehension Hasaga from this work. And let's start with the quotation on the handout. I would like to quote. And after you know that all true human comprehension generally, and if it is close to the intellect as intelligible, or if it is far from it as sensed, even if it is in the middle, which is seemingly mediating, they all come from God. May He be blessed. I have no doubt that the idea of this difference will not escape your intellectual discernment, which is found in every act of comprehension, Hasaga. Even so, I will make you aware of this matter. Know that anyone who pursues one thing to comprehend it, and he does comprehend it, will be called one. Hence, logical implication, yes. And all the comprehension is divided into three parts, which is the senses, the imagination, and the intellect, typical triad for Abraham Abulafia. They are five organs of the sense, as it is known: the eyes, the ears, the nose, the palate, and the hand, along with all the body and the forces that build them: sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch. And the comprehension attained with these five means, as the five powers mentioned, which are divided into five general types of comprehension. They are vision, like an apple. We are able to see an apple. Also, there is later mention of another sense, namely touch, and hearing a strong voice, or similarly smelling something. And these forms of comprehension are together considered as one, and it is the analogy of the apple. And these forms of comprehension apply to many things, and they change and can be substituted one for the other. And it is a kind of synesthesia already mentioned here, not directly, but the potential of translation. It is underscored. And these forms of comprehension apply to many things, and they change, we know. And the comprehension of the imagination draws from all these five forces in the mind, and it means the faculty of imagination, koach hadimion, becomes strong when one negates them, when relying on them according to their potential. And I wish to stop this quote because it is going much, much longer with the detailed analogies, and we are returning to an apple later. However, I think that apple is just a perfect example for us. example of sensory perception, of sensory perception's labor, and a symbol of temptation, of lower instincts and desire. The orchard of sweetly smelling apples is well-known Kabbalistic allegory of Shekhinah, the lowers of the divine emanations called divine presence or indwelling. The Abulafian apple is perceived by all five senses, and thanks to mediation of the faculty of imagination, grasped by the intellect. Abulafia was an ardent student of Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed, and of course also of Maimonidean philosopher Hillel of Verona, and therefore we are able to discern here a very strong inclination towards the acceptance of Aristotle's and Maimonides' approaches to the senses. Touch appears as a primordial sense, a more carnal sense predicated on the experience of being in the body, of being as the body, of being embodied as such. Touch and taste imply an unmitigated materiality, a skin-to-skin relation. Skin to skin. My skin and other skin, they are two surfaces. They are in play. Which Aristotle saw touch and taste as common senses and general senses for both men and animals, and he related them to the intemperance inherent in the pleasures of touch. Taste has been seen as a kind of extension of touch. And of course, all these senses were seen a little bit more negatively as shared with animals as the lowest, the most primordial senses. This judgment, of course, has been reinforced by Maimonides in his Guide for the Perplexed, in which the sense of touch was evaluated as something shameful. Sense of touch is a bodily faculty, an external or corporeal sense, one among five others. And we know them already because sight or vision, hearing, touch, taste, and smell. Sometimes some of the Kabbalists mentioned not only all these five kochot haguf, but also one additional koach. And this one additional koach was the power of movement. Chaim Vital, the pre-modern Kabbalist, mentioned also the movement as an additional force in his Etz Chaim. In general, we can say that they are more corporeal senses and also some loftier senses, because especially sense of vision, hearing, and also sense of smell, when seen as more spiritual senses or as senses leading to a kind of spiritual experience. For medieval and Arabic authors, usually imagination has been regarded as a kind of spiritual or internal sense. And it has been already beautifully described by Harry Wolfson in his paper published in Harvard Theological Review. Abulafia's treatment of imagination, called Hadimion, shows, however, its Janus phase, because we know that sometimes this type of mediation is already linked to a kind of deception, and the deception itself is caused by demonic forces or by Satan. And therefore, the entire interplay of dimion, imagination in Hebrew, can lead to many linguistic games which are exactly part of Abulafian heritage and part of Abulafia's way of thinking, namely this relationship to the Latin anagram of medium, spelled medion or medium, meaning the middle, as well as I already have mentioned, to the demonic force, possible force, which create a kind of deception, the daemon would mean the demonic thought. And therefore, imagination is not necessarily giving us the clear statement about the reality and needs to be accorded by koach haseher, of course, by the faculty of intellection, by the intellectual ability which is connected to the divine intellect, to nous. In ancient Greek, it would be the approximation, especially in the Neoplatonic tradition. However, I would like to introduce you with a general view of sensory imagination. Namely, sensory imagination belongs to a broader branch of experiential imagining, which also comprises non-sensory experiences, as for instance, some affects. As per philosopher Robert Hopkins, author of the Profile of Imagining, published 2024, imagining or sensory imagining is situated in between perception and conceiving. Imagining operates with present-absent objects. In other words, objects present in the absence. Imagining, at its very core, can be grasped as nothing more than a modification of consciousness. Sensory imagining utilizes structures usually found in perception by operating with so-called sensory profiles. In the process of sensory imagining, we, as Hopkins posits, spontaneously and manifestly represent appearances to ourselves instead of being presented with them. He called this entire process as conjuring. I infer that sensory imagining is emotion within kabbalistic texts, and especially thanks to the figure of the speech, which is called synesthesia, and about which I spoke at the very beginning of this lecture. As long as the described is not explicitly marked as a product of dreaming, halom, or a sort of hallucination, or therefore it is not an experience obtained in the condition of taking some medical plants or eating some specific fruits, we can argue that the entire outcome, the entire writing or the entire message, it's an outcome of sensory imagining's power, an outcome of the writer's active nature. On the level of textual operation, so in writing, this power of writer's active nature, or the power of sensory imagining itself, it's represented as a result of synesthesia, or as a kind of synesthetic description. I wish to direct your attention to touch in writing, sensory imagine and touch within kabbalistic texts. And to pursue, I would like to ask you a question. Do you really think that there is something shameful about sense of touch? That it is really a source of shame or disgrace as proposed by Maimonides, or as described in this short passage from Abulafia's work? Because we have absolutely different type of argumentation established by other Kabbalists in Letter of Sanctity, Igeret HaKodesh, composed in the 13th century Spain, and most likely it was composed by Joseph Gicatilian. Many argue about it. It was at the very beginning attributed to Nachmanides, but according to the vocabulary and with the entire wording interplays, imagery produced, it is now rather attributed to Gicatilian. And here the entire Maimonidean argument was turned all around. And I wish to quote again, but before I quote, I would allow myself to drink a little. and I am returning to my full faculty of speech now. So, beginning of quotation. And the secret is that when a drop of semen is drawn down in holiness and purity, it is drawn from the place of knowledge and understanding, which is the brain. And it is known that if it does not contain any great holiness, the union would not be called knowledge. And the matter is, like Rabbi Moses of Blake's memory taught in the Guide for the Perplexed, when he praised Aristotle for what he said, that the sense of touch is shameful for us. Far be it from us. It is not as the impure Greek has said, for in his statement there is a small trace of heresy. Believe that the world has been created as an intentional act. This cursed Greek would not have said this. However, we, masters of the Holy Torah, believe that the Lord, may he be blessed, created all according to the decree of his wisdom, and did not create a thing which is defective or ugly. That if we would say that sexual union is something shameful, therefore sexual organs are organs of disgrace, and the Lord, may he be blessed, created them as it is said. He has made you and established you according to the Deuteronomy. And your sages of the blessed memory said in the Tractate of Hulin, teaching that the Holy One, blessed be He, created structured organs in humans. And in Midrash Kohelet it is said, with respect to the formulation, what He has already been done, which may be explained as follows. He and his cart considered each particular limb and designed each of them in its proper place. Therefore, this entire reversal that the sexual organs are absolutely not organs of disgrace because they have been created according to the divine pattern, in accordance to the will of the Holy One, and therefore they cannot be something shameful. And it makes also sense to say that the entire union, which in the Bible, in the language of the Bible, is known as knowledge, because it is kind of carnal knowledge implied there, it's also not shameful itself, as it is absolutely the theological act to help the divine union of the hypostasis called Sefirot. Therefore, the relationship between man and his woman, it's very important to be perpetuated in the proper manner, with the proper intention, in sanctity, with proper kavanot, so it means also intention, usually to the angel Metatron, as many of the Kabbalists would say later. Bearing in mind the mechanics of sensory imagination and synesthesia, we will focus here on one exemplary act of touching and Kabbalistic variations on this motive. And it will be the Edenic story of Eve touching the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And here we will again invite our Joseph G. Catilia to present his view on this particular event, which changed entire human history and which changed also the entire mystical and metaphysical sense of human existence, and not only human existence, of the existence of the universe. And here again, I would like to quote this beautiful passage, because it is just very playful passage, and it goes even longer, the entire so-called secret, this Kabbalistic genre of shorter ruminations, which are not short from, or not necessarily so short from our modern perspective, but which are very concise and give usually one particular hint how to understand some narratives, biblical, Talmudic, or in general, how to understand importance on one object, on one festival, etc. I would like to quote. And this is the secret of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And according to the cautions given by God, who commanded the first Adam not to touch the tree of knowledge, for both the good and evil cleave to it. In the book, it is the word used in Hebrew here. Even though one is outside and the other inside, until such a time that the foreskin would be separated from it, that is written, you have reckoned its fruit as uncircumcised orla, and it is written, she took of its fruit and ate it. And the image, Tselem, was brought in the palace, and the external impurity was brought within, and it is written, the serpent was more cunning than any beast of the field. I will skip a passage. Know that all of God's creation is good. When each of them, that means his creations, is found in its, I would add, assigned place. Each one at its place that he prepared and established in his creation. And that is, or it means, the products are crowned with knowledge. And if it were the opposite and each would be removed from its place, it would be totally evil. And this is the complete and good total wisdom of his creation of the world, in that all the creations which God created are in their forms and their place, which he prepared and established, which are called good, and the opposite is called bad, or we can say also evil. I do not think that I will be able to quote the entire passage, but here later in this text we have also very important repetition of certain motives, and it would be important also to recall it. And there is found the tree of knowledge, good and evil, which cleave to it. The good governs when the serpent is outside in the place that is known to you, and evil is there when the serpent, turns to the holy place. Thus, good and evil are found cleaving to one and the same place, and by this matter it is called the way by which they join. However, because of the woman, and after you come to know this, now that God, may he be exalted, wrote in the Torah, and you do not draw near to a woman in the time of her ritual impurity, it means nida, and it is written, and of her that is sick with her menstrual impurity, nida. And it is also written, if she is cleansed of her discharge, she shall count 7 days for herself. And it is written, you have reckoned its fruit as in uncircumcised orla. For the tree in itself is good, and there is no evil in it. However, the fruit as such has in itself both good and evil. End of the quote. It is very interesting elaboration on the touch of evil, which via contextual extension has been polemically tinted and understood as touch of the Gentile, the uncircumcised one, specifically his foreskin. Gicatini evokes here the halakhic prohibition of orla expressed in Leviticus for the land of Israel for the first 3 years after planting the tree. Its fruit is considered forbidden from consumption. Finally, he engaged in the discussion on female ritual impurity during her period, namely nida, which is a kind of impediment of all carnal marital pleasures. The untouchable triad is therefore the fruit of the freshly planted tree, foreskin, and menstruating woman. This exposition belongs to the greater tradition of secrets, and here this part is called Secret of the Serpent, Sotcha Nachash. However, It is also pertaining at another Kabbalistic composition, namely Sothegos, Secret of the Nut, which is already establishing a kind of a picture that everything what is outside is generally exposed to the force of impurity, when the kernel of the fruit itself is seen as the source and core of holiness. The impurity dwelling outside of the kernel enters the fruit's inner part under the guise of a worm. On the metaphysical plane, as long as each creature is inhabiting its prescribed place, a state of supernal homeostasis is not endangered. A kind of misplacement or a kind of sudden metamorphosis or intermingling entails disorder in the structure of the universe, and it is the way of awaking the forces of evil, which are also linked, and it is discernible here in this secret, with the female part of the divine emanation, with the female flank of the tree, of the Kabbalistic tree of divine emanations. Touching the tree and eating its fruit hints here at an illicit sexual relation between Eve and the serpent. Through the sense of touch and instinctive quality of a body, it's symbolically transferred to the touching subject, from the touched object to the touching subject. It is becoming one. It permits the forming of so-called, I would call it, according to Michel Serres, mixed body. And here we have very beautiful philosophical expression of it. On the skin, soul and object are neighbors. And here, what remains now is to think about mingling itself, the softening, the leveling, the planning, the smoothing out of hardness into softness. It is time to write about mixture and filtering. Reste à penser le mélange même. Reste à penser l'harmonisement, l'arrasement, les coups de rabord, le lisage de la dureté en douceur. Nous saurons écrire sur le mélange et les filtrages. It would be the original wording. And now we can ask basic question: how does such mingling occur? Pre-modern Kabbalists, under the sway of diverging interpretations of Lurianic Kabbalah, gave a more detailed account of this enigmatic form of touch. For instance, Rabbi Isaiah Horowitz, best known for his prominent ethical Kabbalistic compendium, Shnei Luchot Hebrit, 2 tablets of the covenant, he explains. We have again quite a long quote. And before everything, by way of introduction, explain the verses. It is all a part of introduction from his part, when he's quoting many sources usually, and he's quoting a lot of Zohar and other Kabbalistic famous manuals, and also Jikatilia, he's quoting Rekanati and many others. First, with respect to the commandment, it is written twice, from it, mimeno, from him, because etz would be male in Hebrew. But of the tree of knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat from it you shall surely die. And in Eve's conversation with the serpent, from it was mentioned only once, as it is said, but of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God said, you shall not eat from it, and you shall not touch it. It is even more difficult, for in the command of the Holy One, blessed be He, it is written 3, and of the tree of the knowledge, etc. And so the serpent mentioned the tree in her words, although God said, of every tree of the garden. And Eve mentioned in her words, fruit of the tree, and later it is written, and the woman saw that the tree was good. This point is even more difficult as Eve must have been very wise, and hence what came to her mind to add the prohibition of touching. This point is even more difficult as Eve knew the truth, that the Holy One, blessed be He, did not direct his command to prohibit touching, but only eating. If so, why did she gaze at the serpent when she pushed forward and touched the tree and said, just as there is no death in touching? How did she learn the commandment full of imperative?
I'm where?
Touching and eating are conditionally one and the same, although touching is related to touching the tree, while eating is aimed at consuming the fruit. Indeed, there is a connection, a sort of extension or transposition of certain qualities between fruit and the tree, for the fruit is just fruit of the tree. And is there any additional reasoning behind its understanding of relationship tree-fruit and its translation into the pair touching and eating? The response has been given by Horowitz himself, because later he mentioned that from the fruit of tree, thus the cause of all this is that the taste of the tree differs from the taste of the fruit, as in all other trees of the world. If all the trees of the world were the same in this, there would be no point for all that was discussed above, and they would not have sinned. Therefore, Adam and Eve were corrupted, and then the land too was corrupted. Therefore, as long as they did not sin, the land was also not corrupted. But with the original sin, everything, the entire paradigm is changing. And later, Horowitz is mentioned that this is the explanation of the secret of image, tselem, and form, or likeness, dmut. And here we will have again Abulafia explaining what is the secret of image and the form. And it will be the last quote, or maybe not the last, but it is the same type of relationship which Horowitz mentioned already in the quote that that the cover of the book or the case of the book belongs to the book as the entire object. Therefore, the fruit represents the tree which produced it, and the power itself, or what is behind, is transferred or extended by the sense of touch and allows for intermingling. When the serpent coupled with Eve, who was the Charlotte, and she was the second wife of Adam, not the first, whose name was Lilith, nighttime, with the second name Yomid, daytime. He placed venom and filth in her, and she ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. She fed Adam, her husband, with the incitement of the serpent, and the two of them died. And if one were to stand at Mount Sinai, the filth of the snake would cease to be. And if he would dwell there, we would not die, because he took from the tree of life and ate from it. Know that the term image, tselem, is wondrous when used for comparison, and so the term likeness, dmut. This is because human comprehension is threefold: sensation, imagination, and intellection. The union with the senses is sexual union between husband and wife, and the imagery union is the union between form and matter, and the intellectual union is the union between the intellect and the soul. And these two unions unite and separate. And the third union is the union that never separates. And the last two unions, which are the imagination and the intellect, the Torah recalls as likeness and image, since they are hidden matters. The first is natural, it is the likeness, and the second is divine, which is the intellect called image. And these two unions solely are divine actions, by the third union is human voluntary action. To make the case short, the relationship between tree and its fruit replicates the link between likeness, the natural, but to some extent also imaginal component, and its divine intellectual counterpart, image, tselem. The impregnation of Eve by the serpent means the transference of felt into her body, and it belongs to the common repertoire of Kabbalists. I will not quote our last text, which would be Moshe Teitelbaum, and here we will have a part of the Hasidic view on the relationship between Eve and serpent, and also on the sense of touch. But according to him, already touch, nothing will change by eating from it. It was the reasoning of Eve, because that is already the result from having touched it. And again, she had no fear from eating it. Namely, it would be this kind of the transference of certain properties of the fruit into someone who touched the fruit itself. Therefore, it allows for a kind of composing a mixed body, for which I'm positing here. So I wish to conclude our seance with a couple of general remarks. I have offered here only a few concise comments on the mechanism of sense of touch within the Kabbalistic sensorium and on interplay between sense of touch and sense of sight, as well as sense of taste. However, touching gaze and ultimate experience of union is usually described by many Kabbalists as a metaphor of consummation. It is the expression of the sexual union below between a man and his wife, and it is perpetuating the union above between the divine hypostasis. To conclude, while external or empirical senses provide basic knowledge about the world, sensory imagination aids in the involvement in the spiritual experience. It does not imply that spiritual illumination must ultimately be detached from the experience of embodiment, of being in the body and physically absorbing external stimuli. However, it does point out the interrelation of body and placement, which also serves as a point of departure for the spiritual introspection and ecstasis. The inner senses, among them the faculty of imagination, but further, even the physical senses par excellence contribute to the formation of the inner man. And we have this formation of the inner man as a part of the doctrine of church fathers, but we have also a kind of an emulation of this doctrine in the concept of the subtle body, tselem. It allows for interpenetration through bodily surfaces, especially the skin, an issue which abhorred Maimonides. Such an intermingling, when the skin manifests as potentially permeable space of encounter, implies the following: body and soul meet each other through the intermediary of the skin, and furthermore, one's soul encounters the soul of their partner through bodily intimacy. Thank you very much for your attention.